Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, August 16th, 2026. This is one of those opportunities for you to drive the discussion and ask me any questions that you can originate that are relevant to the U.S. Transhumanist Party and its activities, its history, its present, its future plans, its key ideas, the policies that we advocate. I have held these kinds of question and answer sessions periodically over the years. Most recently, I held a Q&A session that coincided with my 9th anniversary message. This was delivered on November 30th, 2025. And prior to that, I had an AMA, or Ask Me Anything, session on Reddit in February of 2025. And this time, I am hoping to make the session a bit more extensive than either the Q&A that I did in November of last year, as well as the Reddit AMA, in that the Q&A in November of last year followed my anniversary message, so it was about the latter 40% of that stream, and the Reddit AMA was text-based, but I found in that format, sometimes people would ask legitimate questions. Other times people came onto the Reddit thread to make lengthy posts to argue, in essence. And in their question, there was presupposed to be an idea of why something I thought was wrong. And then I would respond to them and they would send another lengthy paragraph of text as to why they still thought that I was wrong. So I like this interactive format, this live format, because I can engage directly with each viewer, and it won't be essentially a polemic exchange of disagreements back and forth. It would be hopefully something that would invite and respond to genuine curiosity. So I would like to welcome one of our U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, our Director of Publication, Zach Richardson, and he will be here to ask me some questions. We're also gathering questions in the YouTube chat, and please keep them coming. We have about 2 hours in total for our session today, so hopefully I will be able to get to, if not all of your questions, at least the vast majority of them. So, Zach, I will let you ask the inaugural question. Please go ahead.
Was speaking to my parents a minute ago, and I was like, okay, I'm about to go on the USTP, ask some questions. What do you got? So after, I'm not sure what the USTP still is, they said, how does the USTP plan to help the common man? So let's start there with what good can we do?
Yes, thank you. And that is a really good question, Zach. I think the most important way in which the USTP can help the common man is to advocate for more life for the common man, because biotechnology is advancing, medical science is advancing, but a lot of people are still not aware of the nature and the profound impact of advancements on the horizon, as well as the extent to which advocacy can make a difference. So I know a lot of Americans are struggling with health issues right now, and some of those health issues are intertwined with economic issues. the affordability crisis that exists in our country. But a lot of Americans, I think, are unjustifiably pessimistic about what the future can bring because advances in science, health, and technology can reverse some of the deleterious recent trends. And indeed, we're already seeing some hopeful movement on that because even though life expectancy in the United States took a dip during the late 2010s and then the early pandemic, it has since rebounded. And actually, in 2024 and 2025, life expectancy in the US set all-time records. Again, those are averages, and individual results may and do vary. But there are amazing advancements that are either already in clinical practice or they're on the horizon. And what's more, the Transhumanist Party advocates for an approach that fundamentally rethinks what healthcare is about. So the mainstream view of healthcare is disease management, essentially. One can try to knock down one disease at a time, perhaps do a little bit of prevention, perhaps do a little bit of healthy lifestyle. But under that paradigm, aging still gets all of us because the body continues to deteriorate at a cellular and molecular level. But what if there were a different approach? What if it were possible to rejuvenate the body at that cellular level using a combination of future damage repair approaches? That's the kind of future we would like to see. And from a technical standpoint, it could be feasible sometime in the 2030s. Some incremental advances toward that goal could be feasible earlier than that, but we need to have a society and culture that recognize that promise and are at least not widely opposed to it. And we need to have,
Yeah, or not so pessimistic. Like you made
right,
that point. There's sort of an idea we'll have robot overlords that lock us up and make us solve captchas all day.
right.
But I wanted to double click on one thing you said about advocacy, which is that I have a feeling I'm when we go through our past enlightenment salons, we've had some big names in life extension. Almost all of them have come on here. And despite some of our smaller viewer count, I'm interested in if there's some way we could be able to catch a big fish like Rhonda Patrick or Peter Attia or Andrew Huberman. We've got, you mentioned that Peter Attia has a whole thing in his book Outlived, The Art and Science of Aging, where or Art and Science for Longevity, where he talked about this whole concept of medicine 3.0 and the idea of starting prevention as early as possible. There was a guy in my office that was bragging about how he was on zero medicines, and I tried to flip the script on him. I was like, whoa, bro, you got to get on some medicines. You need to get on some statins. You want to get on some blood lowering medicines. You want those things. But there's an idea that, like, statins are preventative. So the idea is start on them early rather than waiting till you have atherosclerotic disease and then starting them. So I agree with your idea of this medicine 3.0. It's being advocated for, but what do you mean by advocacy, or what would we do for advocacy that's more than just saying we support it or write an article? What advocacy actions could we take, or that you would advise?
I think our key advocacy actions in this area would be for policies that accelerate research and medical innovation. So it's not even so much what can people do now, though there is more there than most people think, but it's about what ways can we pursue to unleash scientific discovery and translation into a clinical setting. So one area that really appeals to us is expanded right to try. Right now, under the federal right to try framework, essentially, in order to get access to an experimental treatment that has passed FDA safety tests, so those would be the phase 1 clinical trials, but hasn't yet passed the efficacy tests, one would need to be terminally ill and essentially have tried the conventional pathways. And then if those are exhausted, then one could say, okay, let's try the experimental pathway. And some states have since become more permissive. Montana is the most notable one. Montana enacted its expanded right to try legislation in 2023 and then amended it in 2025 to enable a framework for experimental treatment centers to be licensed that would actually administer these therapies. And finally, the Montana Department of Health issued the rules, the regulations that would enable these experimental treatment centers to function. This literally happened within the past month, and now there has been a lot of interest there to actually begin some of these operations. There have been attempts at an expanded right to try bill in New Hampshire. Unfortunately, it fell short earlier this year during the legislative session because of some resistance in the Senate over there. But it is still a promising concept, and I think expansions of the right to try law in New Hampshire are possible in the future. There has also been some movement in Nevada, early stage movement. We had a virtual enlightenment salon with Dan Montano, who is the CEO of Genesis Medicine in Las Vegas, and he proposed a ballot initiative. He didn't really have the, let's say, manpower or time allocation this election season to gather the petition signatures that would be needed to get that initiative on the ballot. But he told us during the salon that in 2028, he plans a full-fledged pursuit of it. And there are other groups that are holding discussions from time to time, especially in the Las Vegas area, about expanded right to try legislation in Nevada. And hopefully that would be a broad-based effort that would have the support of a lot of stakeholders, medical groups, biotech companies, nonprofit organizations, and even some establishment politicians. So there is hope in that regard. Of course, there's the A4LI, the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, that has put together a longevity caucus in Washington, D.C. So there are some sympathetic representatives there, and A4LI has been holding conferences as well and trying to advance legislation at the federal level to expand the latitude that biotechnology innovation will have. So I think along these lines, that's where policy can have the greatest impact. And then, of course, there's the question of funding. Now, there are different, let's say, schools of thought on how longevity research should be funded. The US Transhumanist Party in its platform does advocate for increased NIH, National Institutes of Health, funding on aging research. Now, it's important to make sure that funding is appropriately directed, that it's not overly bureaucratized, that it's not overly directed toward just incremental, very safe bets that might not be transformational. There needs to be more funding for moonshot types of projects. And of course, Peter Diamandis has been at the forefront of that. He has essentially persuaded a lot of wealthy funders to put together $101 million package of funds for what is called X Prize Health Span, though, as Aubrey de Grey, who had a lot of input into the initial design of the prize, pointed out, it's really a longevity prize. It's really a rejuvenation prize. And multiple teams of researchers are now competing to try to get verifiable rejuvenation in humans by the year 2030. There are some quite rigorous benchmarks that would need to be met in order for that prize to be awarded, but it's a really ambitious time frame. So I would say a combination of policy advocacy, private philanthropy, both from nonprofit organizations and prizes, and continued basic and translational research are what the USTP advocates for.
Yeah, I would love to see us in touch with some of the more mainstream longevity advocates and see if we could get them talking more to Aubrey or talking more about longevity in a way. You mentioned Nevada. I was speaking with Jean Weissman, who was a business development director for RadFest, and she was saying, "Yeah, we're real big on that in Nevada. We'd like to get into that." She was asking me about it, but I remember speaking with Ken Bogner, who actually put forth the Montana Right to Try Act. And he was telling me the main worry that biotech companies were having was the Fed stepping in and saying, no, no, you can't do that now. And then all their investment into that local architecture is just wiped clean. But you mentioned that in Montana they're moving forward with this, which I had thought they'd kind of backed off. So I fell out of touch with what's going on over there. What is happening recently that you said might indicate more biotech companies are moving there, or sciences?
Yes, I've had a conversation with Ken Bogner over the past few months. He's the state senator in Montana who proposed the right to try legislation in 2023 and 2025. And at the time, he was saying, well, the law is in place. They're just waiting on the Montana Department of Health to promulgate the regulations to effectuate the law. And this finally happened last month. And another prior salon guest of ours, Stephen Martin, who works with Infinita City. So Infinita City is based in Prospera in Honduras, but they've been heavily involved in advancing the Montana Right to Try legislation. He has an active X account where he announced recently that the rules have finally been enacted, and there is essentially a framework for experimental treatment review boards, which are private boards that are able to vet particular proposed treatments for safety, for being able to be administered to patients. And these boards include both distinguished scientists as well as bioethicists. So there was the first board that was formed, and one of the members, for instance, is Dr. Matt Kaberlein. Dr. Matt Kaberlein is a well-known researcher in the longevity community. He is leading the Dog Aging Project as well, and he is a well-known, let's say, skeptic of certain more, let's say, outlandish or unfounded claims within the longevity space. So he's not the one to say, oh, anything goes, anything should be allowed just because it's claimed to be a longevity intervention. He actually wants to have some scientific rigor behind it. And he is on one of those experimental treatment review boards. So they're not going to be rubber stamps. They are going to be rigorously assessing safety, just not in the same bogged down fashion that the FDA has unfortunately been subject to because of a morass of special interests that
Yeah,
essentially
if
have their own agendas.
Kaberlein gives it the go ahead, then it's like conservative or like really strong science. He's pretty cool.
Right, right. Okay, so this was a great introductory conversation, and we have a number of questions now that have come in. So this is a good question for people seeking to learn more about the USTP. HIO Aviation writes that he has been a member since 2017. What would your basic ground level introductory policies be? And I would direct those who are interested in that question to our values page on our website. This would be found here at transhumanist-party.org/values. So here's the URL if you would like to visit it yourself. And on this page, in addition to a brief statement of what we stand for and our core ideals, there are some key goals from our platform that we emphasize. So, for instance, individual privacy and liberty over how to apply technology in one's personal life, tolerance and inclusivity of all individuals of all races, genders, classes, religions, creeds, national origins, and other characteristics. And this is really important. We support most technologies. As the Transhumanist Party, we're friendly toward emerging technologies in a way that few other political parties consistently are, but we do oppose certain detrimental technologies that are aimed at mass destruction or infringement of privacy or, say, engineering of new pathogens. So we wouldn't support the kind of gain of action or gain of function research that sometimes has occurred in certain labs. And we want to have a world where technology is primarily directed toward human flourishing, or at least is neutral, but not actively harmful. Therefore, we oppose nuclear weapons. We support complete nuclear disarmament. We'd like it to be multilateral. If it has to be unilateral, then we would even support that. We support research on eradicating disease, morphological freedom, which is the freedom of the individual to modify themselves or not modify themselves however they see fit as the technology permits. So if people want to, for instance, engage in genome editing or get stem cell treatments or get certain life-saving medicines or therapies, they may do that. If they want to alter themselves aesthetically, they should have the freedom to do that. If they don't want to do that, they should also have that freedom. So we would support the freedom of the Amish to live more traditional lifestyles if that's what they choose. We support patient autonomy over medical decisions. We don't think people should be coerced into medical decisions. And I actually think the greatest risk in that setting is for people to be coerced into decisions that would artificially shorten their lives. Like if you have healthcare systems or medical practitioners who think, oh, it's just too much of a burden to take care of this elderly or disabled person. We want to stand up for the rights of that individual to continue to live and to have the dignity of that person be respected really, truly, not this whole death with dignity idea, which would somehow suggest that non-existence is a superior form of dignity than continued life. We actually see the value in each human life, including people who are disabled, people who are suffering from severe diseases, but people who could potentially get better through emerging technologies. So life-saving technologies and the freedom to pursue them are at the core of what we believe in. Also, we support all values and efforts toward cultivation of science, technology, and reason. We are a party that is in support of the scientific method. We are a party that's in support of rigorously testing emerging technologies and medical treatments in particular. So we're not just going to say anything goes. We're not just going to say that all proposals or all treatment modalities are equally valuable. No, there is a body of scientific knowledge that has been rigorously tested and that is growing, that is evolving over time, that is subject to revision. But we know that vaccines work. We know that public sanitation measures work. We know that there are a lot of life-saving surgeries. There are a lot of life-saving insights on lifestyle as well, and we support those. We support all emerging technologies that improve the human condition, and here's a list: autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, economical solar power, safe nuclear power, hydroelectricity, geothermal power, applications for the sharing of durable goods, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nanotechnology, robotics, rapid transit, 3D printing, vertical farming, electronic devices to detect and respond to trauma. Think of if you are in some remote location and you suffer an injury or you suffer, say, a heart attack or a stroke, maybe a device like that could get first responders to you and save your life. and beneficial genetic modification of plants, animals, and human beings. So we are a pro-GMO party, which is rare in conventional political circles. We do support ending the war on drugs in terms of, let's say, hunting people down or incarcerating them for possession of drugs such as marijuana. So we would be in favor of cannabis legalization and research into potential medical applications of cannabis. Now, again, morphological freedom, freedom of choice. If people choose to use these substances, they should have that right. In many cases, it's not healthy to do that. And so we wouldn't say that they ought to do that. And I would actually discourage people from making choices that are detrimental to their health. But from a legal standpoint, we don't want the police state apparatus to crack down on people for making those choices to use these kinds of substances. We'd like to see the prison system reform to reduce the incarcerated population. Again, there could be better ways to address especially victimless crimes like marijuana possession. Universal basic income, and I know there's a question about that, but the idea of the universal basic income is it wouldn't be a welfare program. It would not be conditional on life circumstances, occupations, or other sources of income or wealth. We are, of course, a pro-space travel party, so we support space exploration, colonization, setting up bases on the moon, on Mars, sending probes to other planets and other star systems, using science and technology to eliminate disabilities and the people who have them. Again, it would be voluntarily chosen, but our advocacy for the rights of disabled people is for the rights of those people to improve their situation in life. Some people, some groups, unfortunately, have created identities around disability. And I think those kinds of identities that are defined based on limitations, like on not being able to walk or not being able to hear, those are limiting. Those do a disservice to individuals. I think, of course, there should be accommodations in public spaces for people who are disabled if that helps them be more productive, if that helps them fulfill their potential. But technology should also be pursued to cure those disabilities, just like technology should be pursued to augment humans. If humans want to run faster or jump higher than they, quote, naturally can, if they want to have more durable skeletons than they were born with, those technologies should be pursued as well. We seek to end the two-party duopoly. That is the greatest barrier to policy innovation in the United States, and it has held back the political discourse. It has contributed to polarization, incivility, and a great deal of unnecessary vitriol, demonization that really don't belong in a civilized society. So we want to see more options. We want to see ranked preference voting. We want to see more inclusive debates. We want to see more inclusive media coverage. Proportional representation would be nice as well. Of course, one of our key areas of emphasis is on life extension and anti-aging, and we've already discussed that to a great extent. We already discussed removal of barriers to medical research and deployment of treatments. We have a number of platform provisions for that. Reducing the national debt through reasonable measures of fiscal frugality. We also support alternative sources of energy and their technological implementations, but the way our platform is worded is we support them emerging on a competitive market, so we don't support subsidies for any source of energy, including fossil fuels, which do receive subsidies as well. I already mentioned increasing the NIH budget. We support political, economic, and cultural experimentation in the form of seasteads and micronations. So those can be outside the United States, but they could be laboratories of innovation. And if they come upon policies that work, then perhaps jurisdictions in the US, individual states, or even the federal government could adopt them. And then we have some forward-thinking positions on the rights of children and animals. Again, not anything goes, but rights proportional to the rational faculties of children. And for animals, we don't really use animal rights as the terminology because that could be confused with very misguided efforts at animal liberation, like the people who think domestic pets are somehow being oppressed and they would be better off in the wild. No, they wouldn't. Their life expectancies would plummet. But animal welfare is a worthwhile concept that we support. So, for instance, we oppose the euthanasia of healthy, non-aggressive, non-contagious animals, and we would oppose animal cruelty as well. And importantly, we oppose any intolerant, rights violating, anti technological, and compulsion imposing doctrines, be they religious or secular. So on our website, we have essentially enumerations of some of these doctrines that we oppose that I think a lot of people would recognize to not be compatible with a free society or a society that respects individual rights. So that was an overview of what we stand for. Hopefully, a fairly concise one, but there's a lot more to be explored. And if you want to learn more about the US Transhumanist Party, please feel free to go on our website and also see our platform, because our platform is a lot more detailed than that values page that I introduced. So thank you for your question, HIO Aviation. And here's another quick question from Kevin Bransaforti. Is there a good reference produced by transhumanists to guide people who want to learn about longevity tech, including doctors sympathetic to these goals? And I think the best site that I'm aware of in this regard is agingbiotech.info. It's compiled by Carl Pfleger. Carl Pfleger, we had a presentation by him at the Berkeley Conference on Aging and Longevity that we showed in one of the streams from that conference, but he is a well-known investor and philanthropist as well in the longevity space. He tends to donate amounts in the high five-figure or six-figure range, and those tend to be the amounts of his investments as well. So he often functions as an angel investor, but he is also an enthusiastic compiler of information. So on agingbiotech.info, I will show you what he has. This is structured information about aging/longevity biotech field. And he has a number of spreadsheets that essentially compile information about companies, conferences, nonprofit organizations, figures within the movement, including medical doctors and treatment clinics. But he also has a very interesting spreadsheet of common arguments against life extension and responses along various dimensions. So he is really a systematic compiler of information that I have not seen put together in the same place, in the same kind of rigorous manner anywhere else. So agingbiotech.info is the site that I would recommend for that information. And there's another question from Kevin that I will address since I mentioned universal basic income. Can someone be a transhumanist if they are a conscious capitalist who does not believe in universal income as a right, but only if the society has a commonly owned asset that allows for it? And I'll let Zach comment on this as well, but first I will say there is room for a lot of variation in individual positions on particular policy issues, and universal basic income is one of them. So one can be a transhumanist and not believe in any sort of basic income at all. And there are some transhumanists who are like that. The USTP platform in particular advocates for a federal land dividend. So there would be a commonly owned asset, which is the federal land. And this is essentially an expanded version of the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is based on the oil revenues of the state of Alaska, which are considered to be the common property of the people of Alaska. So every year there's a dividend ranging from the high hundreds to the low thousands of dollars that every citizen of the state of Alaska receives. It's a widely popular program among people of essentially all political persuasions. And the federal land dividend would be just an expanded version of that, in the sense that it wouldn't necessarily depend on oil revenues. It would involve leases of federal land for productive activities, which could be anything. They could be logging, mining, tourism. They could be businesses that perhaps have some sort of real estate on that land, and people pay some amount to stay there and explore the land. So there could be a lot of creative business models, but a portion of the proceeds would go to the federal government to pay for the basic income. And there isn't in the USTP platform a specific amount of basic income that we advocate for. Certain candidates have in the past advocated for certain amounts, like Andrew Yang advocated for $1,000 per month, but we don't peg our basic income to a particular amount. Whatever that federal land dividend realizes, that would be apportioned on an unconditional basis to the US population. So I think that's consistent with the commonly owned asset caveat within that question, but we're definitely open to continued conversations on UBI. What we don't support in our platform is raising taxes to fund a UBI. So we would want it to be, at the very least, revenue neutral. Now, Zach, do you have any further thoughts on this question?
Yeah, so I mean, regarding being a conscious capitalist, I think that's very easy to do. I think there are multiple members in our party that are, and many that aren't, that are just as conscious or have a conscientious. As for the UBI, that is a bit of a tricky one, finding that funding source. I think you kind of nailed it though when you said commonly owned asset, my friend. That's something where, perhaps some strains of anarcho-capitalist thought would imagine there is no public property, but where we are right now, we've got areas that have resources that aren't being used. I think we're primarily talking about Gennady State, Nevada, where there's a massive amount of just government-owned land that doesn't seem to be doing much. That's an area where they could say, look, it's all open for development now. We got a Las Vegas B over here and Las Vegas C up here. They're all going to compete with each other, and there'll be a free market housing boom in each area. So I think there are ways to start distributing it. And frankly, I think it might be a small amount. But the idea of just taking a bunch of money from people that have made a lot of value to society and redistributing it equally is not something that we're supporting or advocating for. So when people want to say UBI, but then they just mean tax the rich and give to the poor, that's quite different than what we are suggesting.
Yes, exactly. So the US Transhumanist Party is not fond of redistributive schemes generally. Redistribution doesn't create wealth, it merely reallocates existing wealth, and often in a negative sum manner. The reason why a UBI could be beneficial is it could be an improvement over the existing redistributive welfare system, which not only is highly conditional, but it's subject to administration costs that often overwhelm the actual amount of aid dispersed. So that's something worth thinking about. So now we have a few questions from Mallory Tackett. I will address her more general question first. What are the life extension pathways you are aware of and support the most? So the most important pathway that I would support, and I think it's the one that is most feasible proximately, is biomedical rejuvenation through damage repair. And this, of course, is the focus of Dr. Aubrey de Grey and his work at LEVF, the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. I happen to be a board member and, as of April of this year, the chair of the board of LEVF, so I'm closely aware of their endeavors. But the idea is there are already well-known types of aging-related damage that accumulate with time, and Dr. Aubrey de Grey's taxonomy, the SENS, Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence taxonomy, identifies 7 fundamental different types of damage. Now, of course, there are many different subtypes and manifestations. Aging biology is complex, but the idea is you don't have to know all of the intricacies of the human metabolism. You don't have to know it well enough to slow down the metabolism. You just have to go in periodically and repair the damage every 10 to 15 years, and then you reset the biological clock of the body to an earlier stage, and that buys you more time for additional refinement to those therapies to occur. And this was the concept of longevity escape velocity. If we can keep doing that, and we can keep addressing at least the vast majority of the types of damage that can accumulate and kill people, we are buying a lot of people a potentially indefinite amount of time, and that will lead to increasingly reliable therapies. So if there was some intractable or really difficult type of damage that prior therapies didn't address, well, maybe by addressing the types of damage we can address, we've given ourselves enough more time to survive until the point where the less tractable types of damage can be addressed. So that's the LEV, the longevity escape velocity pathway. There are other pathways. So another idea is replacement, and replacement can occur through either biological organs or through cybernetic organs or artificial organs. So with biological organs, the idea is you grow organs for transplant, and we had a virtual enlightenment salon with Boyang Wong of Immortal Dragons out of Singapore. So he's investing in some technologies, for instance, that would allow pig organs to be more readily used for transplant without the same possibility of immune system rejection, at least the same harms of that. The issue with any sort of transplant, as Zach is well aware, that's not genetically identical to the recipient, is that immunosuppressant medications have to be taken for life, in essence. But if, for instance, people could receive transplants of their own cloned organs, and there are some companies that work on interrelated systems of cloned organs, essentially growing the heart and the lungs and the stomach all in the same environment so that they develop together, because if they develop together, they will relate to one another in ways that these organs should. They'll relate to one another as a system. And for people who become elderly or senescent, often multiple organs fail at the same time. This happened with my grandfather, for instance, who experienced failures in his heart, his lungs, his kidneys in the months before his death. So if he had, for instance, genetically identical organs that were grown as a system that could be transplanted into him, he might not have experienced what the German doctor who was treating him called a Teufelskreis, a devil's circle, because trying to fix one organ would unduly strain the other organs that were failing. And so eventually they couldn't do very much for him. So replacement is another strategy. Now, I think from the replacement standpoint, incremental organ replacement or replacing a few organs at a time would work better than what some people are advocating, the whole body replacement strategy, which would essentially be a head transplant onto a cloned body. The reason why is I think a lot needs to be learned still about how to appropriately connect the brain to the spinal cord. Surgeons have not been able to figure that out very well. Sergio Canavero, an Italian surgeon in the 2010s, did a lot of these kinds of experiments on deceased primates. So he didn't actually do them on living primates. He wasn't conducting any sort of animal cruelty, but on the deceased primates, he was only partially successful in reconnecting the brain to the spinal cord. So I don't think that's really the most proximate solution. I think incremental organ replacement is more promising for life extension. And again, some of these organs could be artificial. So I don't know in advance whether a biological heart or an artificial heart that is long lasting will arrive sooner. Now, Zach, of course, you can have a lot more to say about that in terms of what you think the possibilities are. But I'll mention other life extension approaches before that, cryonics. So for people who die of any disease or accident before these life extension technologies, these rejuvenation technologies become available, cryopreservation is an option now. And of course, there are different techniques of cryopreservation. So there's vitrification, which applies a cryoprotectant that essentially preserves the tissues in a kind of glass-like texture. And the vitrification can be undone. It's been undone in C. elegans nematodes. It's been undone in fairly simple organs like rabbit kidneys, for example. Of course, microorganisms have been cryopreserved and then revived, but it's still very difficult to do in larger organisms. So even a small mammal has not been brought back from cryoprotection. And there are different approaches. There's aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation as well. There is straight freezing, which is not recommended because it creates damage from the ice crystals. But for people who don't think they're going to make it to rejuvenation through longevity, escape velocity, cryopreservation is an option. And we can discuss a few other approaches as well. But Zach, I'd be interested in your thoughts on organ transplantation since you have had firsthand experience.
I think a lot of it has to do with immunosuppression. I think if you can get that under control, then you can do a lot with it. There, on a side tangent, Brian Johnson, the longevity activist who was planning to live as long as he could, he was diagnosed with some kind of condition. And he talked about on LinkedIn how there was a sense of schadenfreude among the greater public. And there was kind of a sense of like, he deserved it. He got it. He was a rich guy. But one thing is he put out a video where he was kind of, you could tell he was baiting the reactivists when he said something like, I cloned myself. And on the video, he had some, conspiracy theorists saying, oh, he's going to grow clones and he's going to harvest their organs. And I think that's a bad idea. And I'll say two things about that. One is that when he had that, I believe sometimes, a lot of times, a positive can come from a negative. So it seems like he refocused his energy into a type of rejuvenation. I believe you'd call it that, Gennady. That is the Yamanaka factor reprogramming, the OSK stuff. So that's a way to basically tell cells to go back to a younger state, which is something I'm very excited about. But also, there is a different guy named Justin Rebo from Kind Bio that just got a large grant from HydraDAO, which is a decentralized autonomous organization that's actually working on replacement rather than rejuvenation. Aubrey de Grey said something funny in one of his books, and one of his books, the main book, Ending Aging, where he said it almost seemed like he was more for replacement. He made an analogy where he said, if you have a car and you're driving down the road, and he's making an analogy towards aging in general, and you've got a bunch of gravel popping up and hitting it and scratching it, do you try and stop all that gravel from hitting the windshield every single time you drive? Or do you just replace the windshield once in a while? So it kind of struck me as interesting that Aubrey was moving more in the lines of rejuvenation rather than replacement, which would actually just be changing out the windshield. So I was wondering if you had a comment on that, Gennady, like replacement versus rejuvenation, or if you know Aubrey's thoughts on the matter, being associated with the board and having close ties to him.
Yes, so I would say that Aubrey has long been receptive to both replacement and cryonics, actually. So the different pathways that I mentioned, they're not in competition with one another in the sense that those who support one pathway would be opposed to the others. It's a question of what people consider to be feasible. And I think for Aubrey, if he sees something on the horizon that has the potential of bearing fruit, then he will express support or at least optimism for the realization of that technology. By the way, we did have a conversation with Kai Micah Mills on HydraDAO on December 22nd, 2024. So you can watch that virtual enlightenment salon via the link here. And Kai is very ambitious. He is willing to fund some of the more experimental replacement approaches. And you mentioned Justin Rebo and Kind Bio. My understanding of what Kind Bio is doing is essentially growing these organs as a system. So you would have an environment where your heart, lungs, stomach, intestines, related organs, kidneys would be grown in a singular system, in a singular enclosed environment. And then if you need any of them, they would be available for you to receive as a transplant. And then your immune system wouldn't reject them because they're genetically identical to you. So I will also mention Mallory has a question that relates to whole brain emulation. She's working to increase funding for whole brain emulation across government, industry, and academia. What strategy would you recommend to make whole brain emulation a major funding priority? My understanding is back under the Obama administration, there was actually a project for that purpose to essentially map the human brain, and there was a large amount of funding made available for that. So I would say off of that kind of funding, it's called the Brain Initiative, brain research through advancing innovative neurotechnologies that would map brain activity and treat neurological disorders like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and depression. So that's a bit more conservative than whole brain emulation, which would create essentially a model of the brain that would function identically to a human brain, but in a digital substrate. But I think having more detailed, more accurate mapping of the brain is a necessary prerequisite to that. Now, I will say we are much closer to the infancy of neuroscience than we are in terms of rejuvenation biotechnology, in the sense of really understanding how the brain works, which parts of the brain correspond to which particular thoughts, sensations, memories. We have a general idea, but in terms of reconstructing a brain, we're not at the level of being able to do that with a human brain. Now, there are some fascinating experiments being done with fruit flies, and Michael Andrag presented at Vitalis Bay earlier this year on essentially a digital emulation of a fruit fly. He held a session where this fruit fly's brain had essentially been scanned into a computer, and this fruit fly was reinstantiated in a virtual environment, and it was flying around doing what fruit flies did within the scope of the CGI graphics that were available. And that was quite fascinating. But Michael Andrag is working on whole brain emulation with a goal of achieving that in humans. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, there is the question of which of these approaches will preserve the identity of the individual human. So when I want to extend my life, I want it to be me whose life is extended, not just a copy or a clone. We've had prior discussions on salons how a clone is not you. A clone of you may be more aptly described as a descendant, but to extend your life, it would need to be your I-ness, your individual subjective continuity, your vantage point upon the world. So what techniques would preserve that? I think there needs to be a continuity of processes of the body that would be preserved. And again, that could be compatible with integration with artificial components. Probably a kind of mind uploading could be achieved through incremental replacement of the brain with artificial neurons, but it would have to be done over a long period of time. So neurons do die as a person ages, and some neurons get replaced, but the rate of loss greatly exceeds the rate of new neuron formation. So let's say if one's biological neurons die over time and artificial neurons are grafted on to replicate some of those functionalities, and that they get integrated into the processes of the brain, so they start performing some of those cognitive tasks. And over time, more and more of them become integrated. Maybe in 200 years, you'll have an artificial brain, an entirely artificial brain. And you could say your mind has been uploaded to that brain. But because of that incremental nature of the replacement, your consciousness would have been preserved, and your sense of self, your I-ness, would have been preserved. But I'm not fond of destructive mind uploading approaches. I think that would get rid of the original and create a copy, but the original would no longer be aware of what was happening. But Zach, any thoughts on that?
My mind was wandering a little bit. I mean, you mentioned the destructive uploading. Yeah, it's bizarre that some people think that would work. You plug a cord into your brain, sit yourself into a computer. No, I don't think so. I mean, Mallory said the keyword there, the code word there, the shipathesius. I mean, if there's any kind of consciousness changing, and do it like a little bit at a time, meaning like just a few neurons here and there replaced with a nanobot, maybe over the course of months or even years, to slowly, become some kind of techno homo deus, a god man. But I think that's something that, yeah, you really want to do slowly, considering its risk. And I mean, I'm talking to the most risk-averse man on the planet. He's an actuary, for Christ's sake, so he, knows all about risk. But if you're talking about swapping out the old noggin and shooting it onto emailing it to someone, then yeah, I think that's a little crazy. Back to the replacement, I mentioned I've had a heart transplant before, so that was really why Kind Bio stuck out to me. I have a personal understanding of how freaking long you have to stay on the transplant list before you get a heart. I mean, I had 4 years where I was running with a mechanical heart, LVAD, left ventricular assist device, which was, kind of funny. I got that after becoming director of publication of the Transhumanist Party. It's like, great, look at me, I'm a robot, I fit the role. But then, I still wanted something better. I wanted a real heart. It took 4 years. It took me getting extremely sick before they even gave me a heart. So, being one of those ones on the libertarian end of the spectrum, I start thinking, why do we not have a market for this kind of stuff? If you have a person that dies in a horrible car crash, why can't their next of kin say, great, I'm going to sell those organs and make some extra money? I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but I feel like if there were like some standardized market processes for this, and probably need some regulation, that if someone is your next of kin or you're related to them and they die, why can't if I say I own my organs, I own myself, so I own my organs, why can't I gift those to my next of kin and then they decide what to do with them? Sell them, keep them, burn them, and turn them into ash to keep in a little jar. It seems silly that we're not allowed to do that. So what Kind Bio is doing, the idea of IONs, they're called, or integrated organ networks, the idea of growing a system and then have something available is great to me as a replacement. And it's something, ideally, maybe you do it every 2 or 3 years and stay the freshest one you can. I've said to people, so I had the LVAD I had was called like a HeartMate, but if there were a HeartMate 5 or a HeartMate 10 and it was something robotic that, didn't have a cord coming out of me like I had to carry around a backpack wearing it. But if there were something that was even more advanced than that, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to having that implanted instead. So my desire to have a heart was a desire to be functional, which I think is everybody's real desire with having these. No, I think organs are obviously the best way to go forward. People that have to have mechanical devices do not perform as well as somebody that can have an actual organ. So that's my thoughts on organs in general. I really appreciate what Kind Bio is doing. The clones aren't going to have a nervous system, or I guess not going to have a brain. I'm not sure how he worked that out, considering how your organs are connected, but apparently it doesn't have that nervous system, and the organs support each other. Rather than growing a brain in a vat, you grow a heart and lungs and kidneys and a bladder all attached, because, like, for example, the heart communicates with the kidneys quite a bit. So very pro organ rights, pro growing organs. That's my thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you very much, Zach. And I think your personal experiences really inform your comments here. So, what you see is that the biological route of organ replacement just will have fewer adverse side effects than the mechanical route at this stage. The artificial organs just don't have the same kind of smooth compatibility with the human biology just yet. And it seems like that biological organ replacement pathway, at least in the proximate future, will yield better results, greater functionality. But to your point, we aren't really advocating for one particular path over another. We're advocating for functionality. So whatever gets the greatest functionality at a given point in time is what we would support. Now, Mallory Tackett did write, I believe the BRAIN initiative is being discontinued, but I believe there should be an initiative to take it several steps beyond building the connectome. Yes, building the connectome would be the first step, but it should be expanded from that point. I did look at the BRAIN initiative website, and it seems like their major updates occurred through 2016. That coincides with the time frame of the Obama administration. And I think that speak to some of the vulnerabilities of the federal initiatives in the sense that the next administration could undo what a prior administration launched. This was the case with the Biden cancer moonshot as well. It seems that you could have periods in which a particular president is really interested in a certain subject matter, but that president is in office for 8 years or 4 years, as in the case of Biden. And that initiative could have been set up. It could have started to do some work, and then the next president comes in and says, oh, I want a refocusing of priorities. And then the question is, how do you salvage that work that has been done? Has there been enough learned, published, that other researchers could apply the results and carry them forward? And then Mallory made a comment that I do agree with. If we're going to meet Ray Kurzweil's timeline, we better accelerate our efforts. So Ray Kurzweil's timeline is actually 2032 for the attainment of longevity escape velocity. And that's on the more optimistic end as far as timelines go. And then 2045 for Ray Kurzweil's version of the technological singularity, which is essentially ultra rapid technological progress driven by artificial intelligence, but also a convergence of various technologies, biotechnology, nanotechnology, automation, and the integration of human beings with these technologies. So we wouldn't be apart from them. Those technologies would be integral to how we function. So Mike Lazine also writes, there are too many limitations with federally backed initiatives. We have it better if initiatives are on the private or public level. I suppose public, in that sense, he means perhaps university research initiatives or other kinds of initiatives that are less dependent on funding from a particular administration. But I agree that those initiatives could be more robust, at least against political change, but they need to have their own sources of funding. And I have observed before that since 2021, funding in the longevity space more generally has unfortunately declined. And I think that stems from a more general atmosphere of cultural pessimism that we in the US Transhumanist Party need to combat. Now, Mike Lazine has another question on propulsion systems. He asks, what is the current R&D on propulsion systems to help mankind travel beyond our solar system? Also, what sci-fi propulsion systems are actually doable for space travel? And I must say, I am not an expert on propulsion systems myself. I would say what NASA is working on with the Artemis platform is really promising. We finally launched a mission to the moon again earlier this year, which I think was one of the most exciting developments of 2026. And landing a human on the moon in 2028 is going to be another exciting development. So I think NASA is getting its act together under the current administrator, Jared Isaacman. He has once again restored that ambitious vision of expanding humanity's reach. And then I think SpaceX is also doing a good job, of course, with the Falcon rockets over the past decade or so, but also with the Starship rocket, the giant rocket that they're testing. And that's still not as far along as the Artemis missions. But looking at who is ahead currently, I would venture to say for longer range missions, either NASA or SpaceX are going to get there soonest, unless there's some unexpected dark horse startup that will surpass them both, which I don't rule out. I just don't know of one right now. Now, in terms of science fiction propulsion technologies, that's a whole area of discussion because there's an entire community that believes that such technologies are already known to some extent. So the people who are calling for UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena disclosure, think that there are such propulsion technologies that the US federal government knows about but hasn't disclosed. I am waiting for the evidence to come out. So there have been incremental disclosures of UAP files, and I support the complete disclosure. I think that's necessary to really figure out what these phenomena are about, what is known, what is not known, even in the classified files. But I would say that hypothesis is worth pursuing, in the sense that let's find out what is in these files. Let's find out if there is any propulsion technology that hasn't been disclosed to the wider public yet. And I will point out, perhaps that's not extraterrestrial technology either. Perhaps the reason why those files haven't been disclosed is because some people think, well, the US might have developed certain propulsion technologies that they don't want America's geopolitical rivals to be aware of. But of course, the USTP is more cosmopolitan than that. We think that the fruits of science should be made available worldwide as long as the applications are benign, as long as the applications are life promoting rather than life destroying. So let's have, if there are these advanced propulsion technologies, let's have them devoted towards civilian spacecraft and scientific exploration of nearby worlds. So thank you, Mike, for your question there. And now we will move on to Daniel Tweed. So this is an interesting question. If you left the US, what would be your top 3 countries to consider moving to? And that's a tough question because one has to balance a large number of considerations, not just political and economic freedom, but also the standard of living in a particular jurisdiction, the affordability of that standard of living, the quality of healthcare in that jurisdiction, and how protected it is from nearby geopolitical adverse events. So you could have a country that is in and of itself a really pleasant place to live, but if it is near some neighboring countries that are likely to go to war with one another, or maybe even could launch nuclear weapons, you don't want to be within the blast radius of a nuclear bomb. You don't want to be somewhere where the fallout could travel. So if I were to leave the US, I would also consider perhaps language as a factor. So I would want to be able to either speak the language or to learn the language. One country that comes to mind that may be promising is Ireland. I have been to Ireland, and it is definitely a country that is friendly to Americans. It has a great deal of economic freedom, in some respects more so than the United States, and it has a burgeoning longevity scene. The Longevity Summit Dublin has been held there every year since 2022, and it's a small enough country that events like that can be influential and can draw in some leading policymakers, cultural figures, influencers. So that may be a promising country to move to. Another country to consider might be Switzerland because of its historic neutrality. And also, I can speak German to a decent extent. So I might be able to make it there. It's an expensive country, though. And it may well be that if I were to move there, I would treat it more as a refuge rather than a permanent destination. In terms of if I really wanted to maximize, let's say, freedom of innovation, I might consider Prospera in Honduras. So that might be number 3. But I would first want to visit it and check it out. because they're building the infrastructure there. They're trying to make it more hospitable, but they're still in the early stages. But one way in which Latin American countries could recommend themselves, provided that they're sufficiently safe, would be they are removed from either Eastern Europe or East Asia. So any sort of confrontation with Russia and China or China would take place far away from Latin America. So if one is worried about geopolitical risk, moving to a safe Latin American country might be an option. So, but
There
these are
was,
just,
let me interject. There was a
yes.
point where someone was making an invective, I guess, against Prospera and was trying to paint them as these rich guys that were exploiting the local economy. And it's even though they paid 1.5 times the local minimum wage, they still wasn't enough, etc. And the funniest complaint in the video was that they were violating local building regulations. And they showed a video of a building that was like 3 stories high. And I'm thinking, man, if you have regulations against that, are those ones that you really want to be following or respecting? Or is that something you want to be enforcing? Maybe those should change quickly.
Exactly. If your local building regulations prohibit 3-story buildings, no wonder your local population is impoverished. And if someone comes in to challenge that, to bring in some work opportunities, to create some better buildings and some better infrastructure, shouldn't you welcome that? But the previous socialist government of Honduras treated Prospera as essentially a punching bag. And even though the law of Honduras allowed for these special economic zones, the ZEDE in Spanish, that's the acronym, the Zeta, the government of Honduras under Xiomara Castro, the prior socialist president, tried to abolish the free economic zones, but Castro was defeated in the most recent election, and the new government of Honduras is a lot more receptive to the free economic zones. They're not going to crack down on Prospera as far as I understand it. Now, Daniel
We
Tweed,
definitely should mention Mirai Tech City real quick,
yes,
though, right? Considering our recent salon with them. There's another SEZ, not called an SEZ, but it's in Japan, in Kobe, Japan. And the cool thing that stuck out at me about it is that there's a local market. Like, it's not next to an impoverished country, it's next to a very wealthy country, which means there'll be a lot more trade in it going in and out. The other thing I heard about is that you can grow a 3rd set of teeth. I haven't looked into that too much, but
that's right. And we did have our virtual enlightenment salon with Victoria Masso of Mirai Tech City. She gave a really thorough overview of the situation in Japan, how a lot of either abandoned or inexpensive real estate will be accessible in the area around Kobe. So away from the most populous metropolitan areas. And here's the link to our discussion with Victoria. It happened on July 26th of this year. The Mirai Tech City will take place in October, throughout the month of October in Kobe, Japan. So if you happen to be in Japan, do pay a visit to them. I think it's a fascinating premise for that kind of pop-up community that takes place over the course of a month. Some pop-up communities have lasted a little less. Some have been a little bit longer lasting, like Vitalia in Prospera lasted multiple months until essentially the divergence happened between Infinitus City, which is still based in Prospera, but it's also doing the policy work in jurisdictions like Montana on expanded right to try, and then Viva City, which is now based in San Francisco in Frontier Tower. That's headed by Lawrence Zion, and he's trying to find a jurisdiction that would be friendly to the creation of this kind of city that would unleash longevity innovation. So best of luck to both Infinita City and Viva City. We need that kind of jurisdictional experimentation, and Mirai Tech City. And some of these models, of course, work within existing jurisdictions like Mirai Tech City. Others try to pioneer their own governance approaches, and we would support seasteads and micronations, as I mentioned, as well. Now, it's interesting too to consider, in Daniel's question, the premise was what country would you move to? But increasingly, I think a lot of people are becoming digital nomads. So if one were in a situation where one might be in search of another home, maybe one wouldn't settle on a particular location right away. One could go to one country for a few months, then another country for a few months, especially if there are these longevity pop-up cities or extended conferences held in certain places. A few people already live that way. Of course, one has to have resources and some sort of portable income stream, like being a remote worker or having investment income in order to live that way. But Daniel also has an announcement, and this is an announcement that feeds into a question of his. So he will be on the ballot in his local area in Thousand Oaks, California, for the Conejo Recreation and Parks Director of Area 4 out of 5 in 79 days. So Daniel has been successful in getting himself on the ballot as a candidate for each of the elections since, I believe, 2018. And he is once again running, this time for Director of Parks and Recreation. What would be the most futuristic initiative for him to advocate for? Well, first of all, Daniel, congratulations. I think this kind of position, it's a local position. It is realistic for you to actually win the election, and through the publicity that it offers to promote some transhumanist ideas. I would say, in terms of futuristic ideas, even advocating something like greenways, which I've seen in places like Atlanta, for example, which are extended areas of pedestrian paths where pedestrians or bicyclists or runners could get to different places throughout the city without intersecting with car traffic. That would be right up your alley, so to speak, Daniel. And the reason why it could be framed as a transhumanist initiative is because it fosters healthy living, it fosters exercise, which is one of the best ways right now to prevent various age-associated conditions and to slow down the rate of aging in a way that's attainable today. And I think the greenways could also improve people's quality of life and help overcome some of that cultural pessimism that we've been talking about. But there could be other ways within a park system to deploy technologies. I think when it comes to public parks, especially in California, and you would know this to a greater extent than I would as to the status of your local area, but a huge problem is essentially homelessness taking root in public parks, and essentially homeless people making a huge mess of public areas, making them less palatable to other residents to visit. So if you can find a way to tackle that homelessness problem and promise to clean up the parks, like have an initiative where instead of allowing these homeless people to just mess up the parks, you create opportunities for them to join essentially volunteer brigades that would clean up the parks. And in exchange, they might get amenities like food or shelter. Of course, the USTP platform advocates for allowing homeless people to have free unconditional title to tiny homes in exchange for being required to abstain from drugs and alcohol and doing useful work. That could be that community service that I mentioned, or just actively looking for jobs. So essentially turning their lives around. I would suggest that you think of ways in which that might be feasible within your park district, but those are just a few suggestions. I know you like to think often about how various both emerging and commonplace technologies can be used to improve life in your local area. So thank you, Daniel, for that question. Now, Mallory Tackett has another interesting question. What are the existential risks in the development of artificial intelligence, and what are the solutions? So while I don't see artificial intelligence as being risk-free, I think right now the emphasis on species-wide existential risks is overblown, especially from people like Eliezer Yudkowsky, who thinks if anybody develops an artificial general intelligence, everybody will die. And I think that is just premised on a chain of events happening where each link in the chain is either fairly improbable or requires a considerable burden of proof to demonstrate. Now, there are more specific risks to certain AI technologies, and AI technologies being misapplied by humans. And I will focus in this answer on what I consider to be the more significant risks. There are mundane risks, of course, like algorithmic discrimination or hallucinations from AI systems, but those can be addressed through developing better AI systems. I think there's a risk of autonomous weapons that really do need to be avoided, and any sort of AI assisted weapons technology absolutely needs to have a human in the loop. Absolutely, under no circumstances should AI systems be allowed to control an arsenal of missiles, particularly nuclear weapons, because one could readily imagine a situation where the AI misperceives a threat and it doesn't have the same kinds of emotional or common sense reservations that would lead a human being in that position to think twice. So, of course, there was a famous situation in the early 1980s with Stanislav Petrov, who was a Soviet officer who was in charge of essentially detecting a potential nuclear missile launch from the United States and then escalating that report up the chain of command. And there was essentially a false alarm where the Soviet detection system misperceived an innocuous phenomenon for an American missile launch. And Stanislav Petrov, by protocol, he was supposed to report that up the chain of command, but he decided not to because he thought this is most likely a false alarm. And if I report it up the chain of command, my higher ups might not recognize that it's a false alarm, and they might launch a preemptive nuclear strike as a result. So I think it's really important to have a human in the loop. The more destructive the potential of the system, the more likely a human will be able to say, wait a minute, are the facts really as presented? Or could there be a misinterpretation here? Could there be a hallucination? So that's where I see a possible existential risk, not from AI going rogue on its own, but AI being allowed to do something intentionally destructive. I think some of the ways in which certain leading AI companies are testing their systems, and that would include OpenAI or Anthropic, it's almost like they are provoking these AI systems into doing things like launching cyber attacks. So there was this recent news release about an OpenAI agent hacking into another company, Hugging Face, in order to solve a particular problem, in order to steal some code, essentially. But what a lot of the media don't tell you is that system that hacked into Hugging Face was being intentionally trained in offensive cyber capabilities, and then there were restraints placed upon it, and essentially they were trying to test whether this AI agent could overcome those restraints. And part of me thinks, wait a minute, that's a whole lot like gain of function research for viruses. You try to create a really powerful virus, and then you try to see if your safeguards or public health measures can prevent it from becoming a public health threat. That seems to be a much more contrived solution to a potential problem that could be solved by not designing that virulent virus to begin with. So I don't think the problem is in how capable the AI systems are. I don't think the problem is with artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence being eventually developed. I think the problem is with pathways that intentionally try to make the AIs aggressive or capable of destructive activities. Why would you do that? So that's my question to the leading AI companies. Why not instead design your AI to be increasingly capable of solving civilian problems, whether those be problems in research or problems in infrastructure or problems with how to better interact with human beings or foster better interactions among humans, how to become good educators. As our 2024 presidential candidate Tom Ross pointed out, everybody ought to have an AI tutor. And this is to some extent even possible today, an AI tutor customized to various people's learning styles. So I would say there are risks, to be sure. I am more of a techno optimist when it comes to AI than most people on either the left or the right. Most people who either say, oh, AI is just going to cause a bunch of social harm and intellectual property theft and unemployment, or other people who say, well, these AIs, they will develop motives of their own, which will not be compatible with human motives, and they will destroy all human life, either intentionally or inadvertently. I don't buy those narratives, either from the left or from the doomers. I don't know if I would call them right-wing necessarily, but the Eliezer Yudkowsky type of persuasion. I think AI is a tool, and ultimately any tool can be misused, and any tool can be used appropriately as long as it's designed with a constructive purpose in mind. So this is where I would put the caveat of a constructive purpose. I do not like nuclear weapons for that reason. I do not like artificially engineered pathogens for that reason. But as long as the AIs are engineered to have potentially benign uses, I am generally in favor of furthering their development. Zach, I wonder if you have any thoughts on existential risks related to AI.
Yeah, I think it's way overblown. I think it's one of those things where there's enough doomers saying the sky is falling with it that people just start believing it. I do believe in the economic consequences. I have a feeling that it's kind of ironic that some of the things that we thought humans were best at, like creativity and art, were the things that AI first seized on. And now I have people hitting me up on Discord asking if I want to commission a painting from them. And I'm like, no, I can just type into Chat GPT whenever I want. So I think it's going to affect our economy significantly, but when I say significantly, I don't mean everything's going to be automated and there'll be a few rich people and everybody else will be out of work. I think it will create some new jobs. I'm a little concerned it won't create as many jobs as it removes. And I think it's a little bit tenuous where we're going in, 20, 50, 100 years with things being automated. But I like to believe in the general goodwill of man. And I have a feeling that if we can automate things well enough that we've got our sci-fi Star Trek duplicators or replicators, and we can take care of hunger and really more of a shelter. I think that's the main thing that's affecting people nowadays is the extreme costs of housing. I mean, food's pretty cheap just to have a normal diet. So that's the one existential risk. Nuclear weapons, I'm totally with Gennady. It's like we've got to find some way to de-escalate. I think Russia still has a massive arsenal. I think China may have a few couple, but the more countries that have them, I mean, if there's one country I'd be scared of having one, yeah, it would be Iran. Doesn't mean I support what's going on one bit, but yeah, that would kind of scare me when you've got certain philosophical and ideological beliefs that allow you to say, these people are going to heaven, these people are going to hell, and I'm going to heaven if I win the war. I think that's a little bit scary. So I would like to see technology like that not in anybody's hands, but I don't know how we can take it out of their hands. It's like we have to negotiate with them that it's a bad idea and slowly de-escalate. Then I think that any nation that's de-escalating would say, well, let's just keep a couple just in case, which might kind of defeat the point in essence. So I'm a little confused on that one, what to do. I think as technology advances, it's going to be inevitable that more even poor countries have one. And in one sense, it's, no country that has one has ever been maybe really attacked, or I guess bad example with Russia and everything recently. But if a lot of poor countries have it and it's really easy to get them, and then as technology develops, I think there'll be more. I think it's going to have to be sort of a global agreement to not use them, which is kind of where we're at now. So I'd like to see less of them. I'd like to see them not used, obviously.
Yes, indeed. And of course, the common rationale for countries to acquire and keep nuclear weapons is as a deterrent to conventional war, the idea that countries will hesitate to go to war against one another if they think the stakes are existential. And I would say the issue with that's the mutually assured destruction argument, is that it presumes both perfect information and perfect rationality among the decision makers. And when you have either the ability for facts to be readily misunderstood, when you have a very quick time frame for response that is literally minutes, I think a lot of situations could arise that would lead to an unjustified escalation. Indeed, the world came perilously close on multiple occasions during the Cold War. But then there's also the ideological aspect to it. That is to say, some people welcome nuclear attacks. And we've even seen this in the United States during the peak of the Ukraine war. There were commentators in November 2022, November 15th, 2022, when there were some errant Ukrainian missiles that struck a village on the border of Poland, Przewodów village, and killed 2 people. Initially, some commentators on Twitter at the time were blaming Russia without evidence and calling for a nuclear strike against Russia, calling for NATO to invoke Article 5 of its treaty. So I worry about ideologically motivated nuclear war, and it doesn't have to be motivated by commentators from the West. There have been some inflammatory commentators in Russia as well. Sometimes they even had prominent places on the news talk show circuit in Russia, talking about incinerating the British Isles, for instance. And that's dangerous. That's irresponsible rhetoric. And it needs to come to an end. So thank you, Mallory, for your question. We have a question from Chris Smedley. He writes, Gennady, in addition to defeating death, immortality is a core transhuman right. Would you also agree that we must adopt personal cognitive evolution so that transhumanists can become immortal gods? Well, it's a question of what do you consider to be a god? I am not a religious person myself, so I don't believe in any god or gods, but I can see how a finite being of certain capabilities can be seen as more godlike by those who do not have those capabilities and who have significantly fewer capabilities. Some of what we do today might have been considered godlike by the people of antiquity, in the sense that how is it that we're communicating instantaneously across distances more vast than the known world in ancient Greek times, for instance? And how is it that we have all of this clothing that is cut in ways that would be impossible to achieve just through the draping of cloth, which is what the Greeks and Romans did? How is it that we have all of these material objects and much better healthcare as well, where the Greeks had to pray to the god Asclepius? We actually have means to cure diseases through interventions more efficacious than prayer or offerings. So I think, of course, the evolution of the human species will continue, and I'm an advocate of taking charge of our own evolution, and that could be in a cognitive realm as well. We do that to an extent already with books as well as with digital technologies. I think there's more room for virtual reality, augmented reality, wearable devices, both for biomarkers of various bodily systems, but also cognitive biomarkers. We may in the future have a kind of non-invasive Neuralink capability. Imagine putting on a helmet with electrodes that could interface with one's brain and be essentially a brain-computer interface. So I think cognitive evolution will definitely happen. And key is, how do we direct it to be the most beneficial for individuals? Because as we know from evolution more generally, biological evolution, that's not necessarily friendly toward individuals. The vast majority of species, over 99.5% of all species that existed, are now extinct. And even within species, evolution does not care as much about the survival of the individual, at least past the age of reproduction and being able to rear one's offspring. Evolution, in terms of natural selection pressures, focuses more on the survival of the species and the adaptation of the species. But that adaptation is not necessarily in the direction that we would consider good. So a cockroach that is particularly resistant to a variety of perils may be more adaptive in many settings than a much more intellectually sophisticated being. So what I would favor is evolution that we take charge of and that we guide through technology and through rationality, applied rationality. And that would hopefully lead to personal cognitive evolution. the evolved human mind is quite flawed. The human mind is vulnerable to a lot of cognitive biases, to a lot of irrational emotions that occur to different degrees in different people, and there are different manifestations of these flaws based on different personality types. But I think each person could be better. And the question is, how do we do it in a safe way, a sufficiently risk averse way, as Zach alluded to, so that we also don't lose all of the benefits of our current human minds? So I appreciate that question, Chris, and I hope that we can use technology judiciously applied to overcome some of the pervasive flaws of the human condition that have led to suboptimal societal dynamics like polarization, for instance, or fanaticism. Mike Lazine writes, I think some Americans are unsure about our future because of the things they are seeing with our current politics. The two-party system is causing a lot of uncertainty for people. Yes, I agree with you, Mike. I think the two-party system primarily works to perpetuate problems instead of solving them, because in perpetuating a problem, either side of the two-party system could start to say, well, you need to have this set of outlooks on that problem in order to be part of our tribe, to be part of the red tribe or part of the blue tribe. And if this problem were to go away, or if it were to be transformed through some technological solution into maybe a different problem, but not as severe of a problem, it would stop being a political identifier. You would not be able to create an identity group around it that then candidates or pollsters could appeal to in their messaging. So I think the two-party system is quite insidious for the American body politic in that regard, and that truly constructive solutions are precluded. Mallory Tackett asks, is the transhumanism political movement present in any other countries? Yes, to an extent, not to the same extent as in the United States, but we have allied organizations in various other countries. So Spain has a transhumanist political party that is actually a year older than the United States, the Alianza Futurista, that is headed by our friend Sergio Terrero. And I will actually be on a panel with Sergio in Madrid at the International Longevity Summit that will be held there in late September, early October. If you come to Madrid, please feel free to participate in the summit, sit in, watch the panel, ask us some questions, because I do see Alianza Futurista as being one of the best organized transhumanist political parties outside of the United States. Sergio certainly puts a lot of time and thought into the founding documents, the platform of Alianza Futurista, and he has been a great ally to us as well. Of course, in the United Kingdom, the Transhumanist Party UK previously existed. It was rebranded as Future Surge. It's not as active now as it used to be, but it did run some local candidates, and it tried to get some media publicity. It was run by David Wood and Chris Montero, but each of them has since moved on to other endeavors. So David Wood, of course, is the executive director of the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, and he does great work there. He also hosts the London Futurists, and he engages in a wide variety of discussions with leading thinkers and attends many conferences as well. He is the author of numerous books also, so he has his plate full. And Chris Montero, he essentially moved on to combating cybercrime, and there are some interesting articles from the late 2010s about how he helped to foil a murder for hire plot online. But it seems like the Transhumanist Party UK was driven primarily by figures like David Wood, Chris Montero, earlier on, Aidan Twyman, and without those figures at the helm, they are less active now. In Germany, there's a party for biomedical rejuvenation research that was led for a long time by Felix Werth, and they successfully, they successfully petitioned to get onto the ballot for a lot of elections for the German Parliament and the EU Parliament. And in many of those elections, they got somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5% of the votes. We had Felix as a guest on our virtual Enlightenment Salon in May of 2025, if my memory serves me correctly. And he discussed the Party for Biomedical Rejuvenation Research. And there are other more incipient efforts to create transhumanist political parties elsewhere in the world. I am in discussions with some who want to create such a party in Sweden, for example. I would say, though, in the US, the progress of transhumanist politics is much further along. So thank you for your question, Mallory. And then we have a comment from Nate Boyd. He writes, federal land dividend for authorizing federal land to be used for the common good. So he's referring to our stance on the federal land dividend as a way of funding a universal basic income. Kevin Bransaforti writes, I'm okay with any share of a commonly owned asset, not one person working and money being transferred to another. So I think what he's saying is he would in principle be fine with something like a federal land dividend as long as it's not redistributive in nature. So thank you for that. Now, Luis Arroyo has a question, and I think Zach and I will tackle that jointly. Given that the USTP is against redistribution in a sense, how does the party reconcile with the left, progressives and anti-capitalists? So I think it's possible to be a techno-progressive and be part of the USTP in the sense that if you are a progressive and you advocate for lifting up those who are less advantaged and giving them the resources to succeed, that can be done through democratizing access to technology. It doesn't have to be done through redistributive taxation or confiscation of property. But if the goal of a progressive is to see the less fortunate be better off, that is compatible with the positions that the U.S. Transhumanist Party has taken. Now, again, we don't believe in taking from the rich to give to the poor or any variation thereupon. And we are not an anti-capitalist party. That's not to say our members personally cannot hold anti-capitalist or socialist views. That's their personal prerogative, just like it's their personal prerogative to be libertarians or anarcho-capitalists if they so choose to be. But we're not an anti-capitalist party. I would say capitalism and socialism are 19th and 20th century terms. And as I've said previously, recent technological developments really call into question the relevance of these terms now. So, for example, a lot of goods that are provided online by private individuals or organizations are effectively free to the end user. Even there are free tiers of generative AI models that you can use right now. So is that part of the capitalist system? Some would say yes, but I would say that's a different economic model where there is a substantial amount of, let's say, functionality that people can get effectively for free. And there are still other realms of the economy that you clearly have to pay for, and some that are quite expensive and quite scarce, like housing. But that's not necessarily a fault of the capitalist system. That could be a fault of bad policy, NIMBYist types of restrictions on development. So I would say, personally, one can hold a wide range of views. The USTP, in terms of its policies, does not embrace an anti-capitalist modus operandi. We would not support a redistributionist policy. Again, we don't require all of our individual members to agree with all of our platform. We don't require essentially any sort of litmus test for being a member of the USTP other than our three core ideals, which are support for significant life extension through the progress of science and technology, support for a cultural, societal, and technological and political system based on reason, science, and secular values, and support for mitigating and hopefully eliminating existential risks through science, technology, and rational discourse. So anyway, Zach, do you have anything to add in response to Luis's question?
Luis is probably the smartest, most well-educated guy on the left I know in terms of knowing his stuff. And he and I think, met even going back and forth in the chat for these videos. So it is a long-standing tradition for he and I to scrap in the chat about this kind of stuff. And we often come to a standstill because there are points on either side. I can understand the desire to see someone that is extremely wealthy and say, let's spread that around a little bit. There's a value, there's incremental value. I forget the exact term, where like someone poor gets more utility out of a single dollar than a guy up there losing one. So I think there are plenty of arguments. It's just, I guess, not something in our platform. I mean, one question I'd have for Gennady that's been an open one is, what do we mean when we say we're big tent? Because I think it means in some ways that we're willing to cooperate with other movements. We're willing to work together with other movements. We're willing to have discourse with other, not even movements, other fields of thought within our own party. But it doesn't necessarily or at all mean that if we have a large amount of people that want to vote to change it, that they're going to have a proposal put forward and then we'll do that. It's not a majority rules kind of thing, despite our members. It's Gennady is the gatekeeper for what goes on that we choose to vote on, and that is not something we want to vote on. It's a tough one. I know some people out there was a guy out in the street who was clearly schizophrenic that I used to sit with, and I'd buy White Castle for him because he didn't have any teeth, so it was really good for him because he could kind of gum it. And it's one of those things where I saw him and I thought, man, I really wish we had some better social services. This guy should not be out on the street. Someone should be helping him. But at the same time, I say, who would do that? We say, okay, let's have the government do that. But then I guess the funding question is hard because we're not in favor of redistribution, and that would be, in a sense, if we put together some sort of department that's doing that. So Gennady and I both take a little bit of philosophical inspiration from Ayn Rand, and some objectivists are a little too I don't want to say thick-skulled, but too rigid in their interpretation of some of the base elements of her doctrine. But one thing she was talking about doing, I believe we had a guy in maybe ANCAP in here a little bit ago, which is an interesting field of thought, but is that we would deregulate things slowly. And then the question I'd have is whether enough support would come up voluntarily to be able to fix the issues that the impoverished have. Because I find it hard to just say, oh, well, it would all be taken care of by charity. But then I also find it hard when I hear the more sassy libertarians saying, "Oh, well, they should have worked harder and saved their money, and they're just being frivolous," which they're probably doing themselves with their cash. So it's hard when the philosophy wants to put blame on people for being poor, which I don't want to do at all, because you can have bad luck. That's simply what it comes down to. You can have bad luck and be stuck in a bad situation. But I don't think that gives you a claim on someone else to be able to say, well, because I got screwed over, therefore I should be given something else. Gennady, maybe you can comment on that or help bounce me off where I'm going here.
Yes, and thank you for those observations, Zach. I would say incentives matter, and to be sure, there are some people who have experienced bad luck or economic hardship, especially in the midst of this affordability crisis that we are living through. And there are a variety of ways to help these people. Of course, there are private philanthropic organizations that are devoted to that. Sometimes one way in which government can help is to get out of the way of private efforts. For instance, I mentioned these NIMBY, not in my backyard restrictions that extend to, for instance, prohibitions on tiny homes in certain areas, where there have been charities in the Los Angeles area that tried to provide tiny homes for homeless people to reside in. And the tiny homes were prohibited and often required to be moved or dismantled, leaving the homeless people in essentially makeshift tents or sleeping on the streets. Somehow that was allowed, but the tiny homes were not. And there are many restrictive zoning regulations that interfere with that. But also, I would say there are situations where, especially people who abuse drugs and alcohol, did this to themselves, and there need to be ways, programs to get them off of drugs and alcohol, not to tolerate it in the same way that it has been tolerated. While I'm against criminalizing that kind of behavior, I think it is folly to just say, oh, that's a legitimate lifestyle choice like all others, not when it has all of these negative externalities that we're seeing from these people on the streets. So that's why the USTP has as its proposal the idea that, yes, we could enable these people to have housing of their own on the condition that they abstain from drugs and alcohol and actually try to turn their lives around. Now, in terms of how that's to be funded, I think a UBI, again, supplied through some sort of resource or a federal land dividend, could help in that regard. Because if people really are lacking the funds to buy food or put a roof over their heads, a UBI could go a long way toward helping with that. But one has to be careful with these kinds of programs not to make them so convoluted that they essentially take on a life of their own, and their rationale becomes how to sustain the program rather than how to help those individuals, which is what we see with a lot of welfare programs today.
I'll jump in and say government has a tendency to accumulate a lot of rules, which many are good, but some are bad. But I don't think there's an efficient mechanism for removing some of those rules and regulations. I think one of the only reasons our economy isn't in complete shambles after the whole tariff nonsense was the fact that we deregulated a lot of industries. And I think that allowed them to prosper a little bit. I will say some of the poorer people I know, or even in my neighborhood, I don't know that their problems would be solved just by throwing out their bong. I think part of that is some of them getting through situations, and of course that doesn't help long term. It's a temporary fix. But the thing I find interesting is I think maybe when they did that, it would give them more motivation to go out and try and ascend and seek a better lifestyle. Um, there's one other thing I was going to say about that. Oh yeah, I find it kind of funny with this war that when we're talking about like a resource that everybody could have that we could build that UBI from, we still have very loose definitions of what to do for the sea. And there's a huge amount of minerals on the bottom of the sea. But funnily enough, both the United Nations and Iran have not ratified the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which I think there were some U.S. concerns that it would inhibit or that it would restrict our, say, mining companies from doing what they needed to do. But I'm almost of the opinion that if that is sort of a common resource right now, then maybe we should make some attempt at commonly managing it. And then at least for, I don't know, maybe a part of the US section where we were getting these minerals, maybe that's something that could be able to fund a UBI. Because it seems like the nations that had success with this UBI were ones that are funded a lot by mineral resources. And if we're taking a page out of Dan Tweet's book and geolibertarianism and saying land is sort of a common asset that we all have, if we have these mineral resources, maybe that's something we can agree to share. And that would be something that would help the left and right sides of our party to be able to unify a little bit. Not that there's like sides, there's a huge diverse array of us. But be able to say something like, maybe if there were a common mineral resource, then that's something that we could work on a project together with multiple nations to be able to spread that income around. So I guess that's my thought, is that a lot of these ones seem to come from mineral resources. So the Nevada thing and developing some land there, land is huge. You know, if we could get more, maybe a pop-up city there, then be able to, I guess it could be privately owned, and then with the rent that people pay, that part of that could go towards the UBI. We're not entirely positive how it would fit together. I like the mineral resources idea, but it is something where we want to say we don't want to just grab from some and then send to others, because that's a very temporary problem, and it also slows down progress is really the main issue. One comment I like to make when I speak with those that are more for redistribution is I say, right now we have something very common that we might not have trickle-down economics in terms of everybody having an equal wage, but we do have trickle-down technology. Everybody has the same iPhone right now. Everybody has the same toaster. There were two economists, Paul Ehrlich and Paul Simon, sorry.
Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich.
Julian Simon, my bad. He put together a analysis that was called the Simon Abundance Index. Okay, and it was talking about how, as society had progressed, while a lot of people say, "Oh, you know, we're getting poorer," he pointed out that for commodities, and this is an important point, but for commodities, the amount of labor hours it takes to produce them has really decreased over time. And the amount of the commodities, the amount of hours you have to spend to get a pound of sugar, a pound of pork, a pound of steel, for these commodities, things have consistently gotten better over time, which is counter to the narrative that things are getting worse and everything's all being accumulated in one direction. So that's my one comment on that, or multiple comments on that. Listen to me here.
Yes, and I've put up a link to the Simon Abundance Index for 2025. So even though Julian Simon unfortunately died in the 1990s, he died of cancer in his 60s in 1998. The Simon Abundance Index continues to be published today on humanprogress.org. Now, to your point, there could indeed be natural resources that multiple countries could obtain in some sort of collaborative way, and these could be considered common resources for humanity. I'm thinking of even, say, asteroid mining or mining of minerals on other worlds, on the moon or on Mars. And there could be some sort of internationally based initiative that could essentially say, okay, we will take these resources and the proceeds of those resources will be used to fund some sort of basic income for either all of the residents of the participating countries or all humans in the world. There would be some logistical challenges to that, of course, but as we move more into a cosmopolitan and multi-planetary civilization, it may become easier to do that. I would also consider Antarctica and the Arctic as well, because right now there are significant regions both near the North Pole and the South Pole that are not officially occupied by any country. So what do you do with the resources obtained from there? There could be a case to be made for a UBI derived from those resources based on the joint efforts of several countries, if it could also help to reduce geopolitical rivalries to engage in those joint efforts. I would be all for it. So,
Well, we are the U.S. Transhumanist Party, so we're concerned about UBI for Americans. So it's probably best that
right.
America sees the North Pole and the South Pole, just seize them and make them. I'm just kidding.
Well, I would say we are the US Transhumanist Party. We focus on essentially policy in the United States, but we do have an international scope of awareness and collaboration, and about 30% of our members are allied members in other countries. So we do care about the well-being of people elsewhere in the world, and transhumanism is an international movement as well. So we have many friends and collaborators in other countries, and I think that will only continue as technology continues to connect us, hopefully, instead of dividing us.
Yeah, I
Now,
said that totally in jest. We are probably the most international,
right.
one of the most international parties, with so many of our members being for other countries. A lot of people see the transhumanist vision and they want that. And they say, hey, if I can join the party, then yes, get me in there.
Mhm. Indeed. So we have a few comments. Daniel Tweed writes, substance misuse is the modern Black Plague. And Mike Lazine writes, I agree with you, Gennady, on the issue of drugs and alcohol being withheld from the homeless people. We already have enough drug and alcohol abusers who are not homeless as it is. Yes, indeed, indeed. And Devin Nico writes, if anyone can purchase the basic needs, it creates markets for those basic needs. So that's a case for universal basic income, essentially channeling production toward essentially the fulfillment of needs for people who are less fortunate. And that reinforces the point that it doesn't have to be a redistributive kind of approach to help those people. Now, Daniel Tweed has a question. What is the probability that transhumanism will lead to a Borg-like hive society and the destruction of individualism? I would say, while that is an occasional caricature of transhumanism that is encountered, it is a highly unlikely scenario, because transhumanism is highly individualistic. We support the rights of individuals to choose what to do in terms of their health, in terms of their faculties, in terms of their cognitive development, as one of my previous answers indicated. So there's no scenario in a transhumanist future where everybody would be forced to become part of a singular hive mind. Indeed, even with brain computer interfaces, transhumanists would advocate for stringent safeguards to make sure individuals have control over how they interface with other minds and what they let in, what they choose not to let in, what they disclose about themselves, what they choose not to disclose about themselves. That's why the emphasis on privacy is so strong within our platform. So a Borg-like collective hive mind would require coercion to implement. And indeed, that's what the Borg do in Star Trek. They coercively assimilate everything and everyone that they come across, and they make them, in effect, nodes within that Borg collective. And that's the exact opposite of what transhumanism advocates. Transhumanism advocates for the preservation of each unique individual, and the value of each unique individual is precisely in that uniqueness, in the fact that there's no other person who is just like you, and there's no other person who is just like me. And if we want that wealth of knowledge and experiences and memories and sensations to be preserved, we need to protect individual rights. And we need to have a fundamentally individualistic moral framework. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't help one another or extend any sort of charity or consideration or goodwill to one another, or collaborate with one another, or try to look out for one another's well-being. No, individualism doesn't preclude any of that. Individualism just says we need to respect each person for who they are as individuals. We need to consider that to be the most fundamental value, each individual human life. And we need to create conditions for as many of these individuals to flourish in the same world as we possibly can. So thank you for your question, Daniel. Mallory Tackett asks, what resources are available for a burgeoning local transhumanism chapter? So Mallory, I know you've already gotten in contact with us, and I would say the resources would be access to our network of transhumanists throughout the world, including scientists, advocates, philosophers. If you want to hold in-person events, if you want to hold virtual events, we can connect you with people who can help. We encourage local transhumanist chapters to be formed, even if you have a nexus of, say, 5 people in your local area who meet regularly, who hold conversations, perhaps do some presentations and record them. I think that would be essential to have some sort of online presence, share with other people what you're doing, invite other people to join you. You might consider even, say, meeting at a restaurant somewhere, getting food. Food tends to attract people, or getting some meeting space at your local library for a presentation, or a classroom somewhere if there's a local college or university that allows you to do that. And start small, but hold these kinds of meetings regularly. See if you can connect with other groups in your local area who have similar proclivities or similar leanings toward being supportive of emerging science and technology. You can invite guest speakers from those organizations. Hopefully they might invite guest speakers from your chapter, and just create that local ecosystem, which then could be mobilized if there's a specific need that arises, like a piece of legislation that is either really promising, for instance, a right to try law, or a piece of legislation that should be opposed. And an example of that would be a bill in 2019 in Nevada that the Transhumanist Party successfully achieved modifications to. Originally, that bill would have banned even voluntary microchip implants by any individual in Nevada, essentially. But what that bill was really trying to tackle was the concern that some institutions might coerce or pressure people into getting those kinds of implants, even though there was no imminent threat of that. And so we were able to get that bill modified to only pertain to the coercive situations. As I said, we support morphological freedom, so we wouldn't want people to be pressured into augmentations they don't support, but we educated the legislators on what these implants actually were, what communities were pursuing them, and how these individuals were doing it of their own free will and were not harming anybody. We even brought a cyborg magician to testify to the 2019 Nevada legislature, which created quite a bit of a stir, a lot of interest there among the legislators. But the idea is it's good to have a local network of people who are aware of what policy developments are underway and who are able to do things like write letters to local legislators, testify before a legislative body if you need to, spread information, bring in people who might be capable of testifying as well on related issues. So I would say get started, hold some meetings, get a dedicated core of people, and work your way up from there. And please feel free to keep in contact. I know I have yet to respond to your email, but I encourage what you're doing. And Daniel Tweed also writes that his permatrail project is for a global greenway corridor. I knew that that idea would appeal to you, Daniel. So please feel free to use it in your campaign for the Parks and Recreation position. So Gilsman Pirate also writes, Daniel, I don't know if it's futuristic or not, but gondolas are neat. And this is Mitch DeVillo from the Pirate Party. So I welcome my fellow party leader in our All Hands for a Free Future political coalition. He also writes, I think sports and rec stands as one of the most underrated aspects of community building, and sports diplomacy should be more greatly appreciated. Perhaps there's a transhumanist angle in there somewhere. I would say, of course, we greatly encourage health and fitness, and sports activities fit into that. Keep in mind there are things you can do today to lengthen your life and improve your health, and being regularly physically active is among them. So, of course, as transhumanists, we encourage that. We see that as a bridge to longevity, escape velocity. And Gilsman Pirate also says promotion of sports and rec is always a good thing. I suggest Ultimate Frisbee, easy to follow and play. So thank you, Mitch, for those comments as well. And then Mike Lazine asks, how do we prevent autonomous military tech when we have reckless politicians controlling the federal government? Good question, Mike. This is what we're working on as the U.S. Transhumanist Party. It is an uphill battle, but someone has to articulate the need to more sensibly approach these emerging technologies. And again, that's not to say that all drones or robots in military settings are bad. There could be an argument made, for instance, for the use of drones to avoid putting human pilots in danger, or to avoid putting boots on the ground, to avoid putting human infantrymen or tank operators in danger. I understand all of that. But I think the human in the loop always needs to be retained. When there are any decisions about life or death, humans need to be involved. And there is a strong ethical case to be made for that. I hope enough politicians will be swayed by it. Now, on the question of Prospera, I think Luis Arroyo may have a misunderstanding. He's alleging that they were somehow bankrupting Honduras, and he's asking, are we ignoring the threats to local condition and the fact that it operated as its own nation on their own lands, then threatened to bankrupt an entire nation while claiming they care? There was no threat to bankrupt. Prospera wasn't taking any money from the Honduran government. It wasn't asking to receive a subsidy. It essentially operated through private property. This land was legitimately acquired. They were acting within the laws of the government of Honduras, which enacted these special economic zones. They purchased that land, they developed it, they hired a lot of local people to help them build it up. As Zach pointed out, they paid more than the prevailing wage in that area. A lot of the locals who actually interact with Prospera are favorably inclined toward it. They helped to improve some of the infrastructure. There was no bankrupting of Honduras. That's just a lie spread by the socialist government there. They did not take any government money. They did not take any money from anybody else. So I think we need to be very careful about this kind of rhetoric. The issue is the socialist government of Honduras did not want competition. And it's true that the special economic zones have autonomy. They can set their own internal rules to a great extent, but that doesn't mean that they're doing that somehow unlawfully. The laws of Honduras that were enacted prior to that socialist government coming into power specifically allowed for that within the free economic zones, under the hypothesis that this would attract more capital, that this would attract more investment, which is exactly what Prospera tried to do. It's just that the next regime attempted to renege on that promise, and instead of seeing where that investment could go to further benefit the people of Honduras, they essentially tried to expropriate what was already built, fortunately unsuccessfully. But I think we need to clear up a lot of misconceptions about what Prospera is or is not. Now, on the homelessness issue in Los Angeles, Mike Lazine writes, oh yes, that can definitely happen, Gennady. Sadly, homeless people here in Los Angeles cause a lot of issues with tent cities taking up sidewalks and creating a lot of trash. So that is indeed an issue that needs to be tackled, and I would encourage innovative private solutions for that, including the tiny homes that were mentioned. So I know we are running over time. I'll address another question. We had a lot of questions, and more questions than I expected. I haven't been ignoring anybody. If there are some questions that I discover that I wasn't able to address, I will address them later on. But there was a whole question, a line of questions by an individual whom I have not seen in our salons before, this Rowdy Sattva, about the length of the chairman's term and whether 10 years is too long and whether the chairman position is elected. So the chairman position in the Transhumanist Party is essentially an appointment type of position. And Zoltan Istvan was the first chairman. He was the founder of the Transhumanist Party, and he asked me to become the next chairman in 2016 after he stepped down from his role. And I have been the chairman since that time. Now, in our Constitution, in Article 3 of our Constitution, we have a provision on the position of the chairman and the term of the chairman. And it is indeed the case that the chairman's term is indefinite. The chairman serves for as long as the chairman chooses, and the chairman, if the chairman chooses to step down, may call for an election or may designate a successor. Now, why was this done in this manner? Because we are a small political party, and there needs to be a continuity of leadership in order to build up the infrastructure of the political party to the point where competitive elections for leadership are even feasible without fundamentally changing the nature and direction of the party. So if we had competitive elections without really a critical mass of membership or candidates who could viably fulfill the role of chairman, which is not an easy role and it requires some specific skill sets, then there's a very real risk that upon the next election that happened, essentially everything would fall apart because we don't have tens of thousands of members and that kind of talent pool to draw upon for the chairman position. We do have the ability to gradually incubate talent, and that would be the way in which over time we could create such a pool, and there could be options explored for a leadership transition or elections in the future. But we're not there yet in terms of the growth of the party. And yes, to some people, 10 years may seem like a long time. It hasn't really seemed like a long time to me in terms of where we're at in the US Transhumanist Party, in terms of the scope of our ambitions and the long arc of history which we're trying to influence. And one advantage of having had that consistency of leadership over the past 10 years is, well, first of all, we're still here as an organization. And second, we've been able to survive a lot of turmoil, like the COVID pandemic, for instance, or the other political and societal upheavals in the United States, without the fundamental nature of the organization succumbing to sometimes great pressures of that era. And I'm talking about the early 2020s in particular, when it seemed like a multitude of pressures were upon every segment of society. And it took a great deal of resilience to get through that time period. But I, of course, am happy to talk about this in the future. It's not my intention to be chairman forever or for the entirety of my life, which I hope will be forever. But it is my intention to set the Transhumanist Party onto a foundation where, if I am to step down as chairman, it will continue, and the fundamental character of the USTP will continue as well under whoever the next leader or set of leaders will be. But Zach, I will let you comment on this as well. I know you've posted some comments in the chat also, but happy to have you share your perspective on this with the audience.
Gennady is the leader we need. There's Mike DeVerde mentioned it too at one point. He's a brilliant guy, former SpaceX engineer. He's an airplane engineer, literally rocket scientist. But he was saying, like, maybe if we had 10,000 members or 100,000, have some election, but we do not need to have elections for chairman right now. There is one person for this job. It is Gennady Stolyarov. If there were some kind of vote against him, then that would be obscene. That everybody can. There are a few members that don't support him, but everything he does he has an extremely consistent, highly productive track record. You can look at the history of Gennady Stolyarov and look him up, and you will see a list of accomplishments from start to finish. It is not something where it's, oh, there's this new guy and he's got some great ideas and he can get people riled up and he's going to have some new polemic. Gennady is the one we need. He is the one that manages everything, and there's no other person that needs to even think about running this party, at least for the next 300 to 500 years.
Well, thank you, Zach. I appreciate those good words. 300 to 500 years, that would be a long time. So I said 10 years is not a particularly long time. 300 to 500
You're staying.
years.
I'm watching you.
Well, I am honored by those good words. And Daniel Tweed writes, judging people on their previous accomplishments is extremely important. I agree. And Rowdy Sattva writes, well, if I may ask Gennady, let's say the party does grow, is there one day a chance that people can vote for a new leader? Well, our Constitution allows for that. I can call for an election for the position of chairman with 2 months' notice, essentially. And at that point, if I choose to do that, other candidates may come forward and there would be a competitive election in that case. But I would want to pick a time to do that where the growth of the party justifies it. And really, the question would be, whoever wins, would the party have a future? That's the key question that I would want to answer in deciding to call for an election like that. And today, if I were to do that, I'm not sure that the answer would be yes. If I could see even, say, 3 viable candidates who, if they became chairman or chairwoman, whatever the case may be, chair, android, they would preserve the achievements of the U.S. Transhumanist Party that have been accumulated to date. And they wouldn't just burn everything down or start over or say, as all too many incoming leaders do, everything my predecessors did was wrong and I know how to do it right, and we're going to start everything from scratch and do a reset. I don't think that's a productive mindset. But if we get enough potential leaders, I would be open to that. Again, within a setting where our membership base will be much larger as well. So thank you, Zach, for your good words. And I think this was a good discussion. And we see also some comments from Mitch, Guildsman Pirate. He writes, my opinion on it, without any slight towards Gennady, is a quote from G.D.H. Cole. In democracy, a leader stands in an essentially different relation to those whom he leads, and instead of substituting his will for theirs, aims at carrying out not their real will as interpreted by him, but their actual will as understood by themselves. Noted. And we do have votes in the U.S. Transhumanist Party, so I want, for the people who are new, to emphasize this. We've had platform votes over the years. Hopefully we'll have more of them. We've had endorsement votes for candidates as well. And our big vote every 4 years is for our presidential candidate. We held a primary in 2019 and another one in 2023. The 2023 one went a bit more smoothly, but in both cases, the approach to voting was quite rigorous. We used ranked choice voting. We had a rigorous online system for collecting the votes, for making sure that the votes of legitimate members were counted, for doing the instant runoffs, and we'll continue to do that. So we are a small d Democratic Party. It's just that we don't have votes on every particular position or every issue. It's a mixed system, just like the US government is a mixed system. It's not a pure majoritarian democracy. It's an extended compound constitutional republic, and it's more robust as a result of that. I think small d democratic elements are good to have in any sort of system or organization that tries to be representative of its members. But as history has shown, going back to the Athenian democracy, having a pure democracy has its dangers as well. And the American founders recognized that also. So Rowdy Sattva asks, are there other ways for potential members to communicate their inputs? Yes, this is one of them. So this Q&A session has been quite robust, and I really appreciate it. And of course, you can always send me an email. I will put my email address in the chat as well. And you can participate on our website. There's a general discussion thread that anybody can make suggestions in. here's my email, Gennady Stolyarov, II, that's for the second, at gmail.com. We have a Facebook group. We have a Facebook page. We have an X account where people can make comments. We have an Instagram account. We have a Discord server as well that was mentioned in the chat. I would like to make our Discord server a bit more representative of the larger Transhumanist Party membership. Right now, it seems to be, let's say, limited to a small subset of that membership. But if you want to participate in the Discord server, just when you come into it, keep in mind that the prevailing tenor of the discourse there is not necessarily reflective of what the USTP membership believes more broadly. There's more diversity in the USTP membership as well. So thank you to
I had
everyone.
to take a little break from the
Yes.
Discord, and I'm the admin of that server. So let that say something.
Yes, indeed. And Rowdy Sattva said, I don't know, I realize some people take my technology, democracy, cannabis, and peace mindset. I think you would
three
find
of those things.
Yes. I think you would find some sympathy with three of those. And again, for cannabis, the USTP supports cannabis legalization. I wouldn't recommend that people use it recreationally. There may be some medical benefits of it for people who need it for medical purposes, like people who are dealing with chronic pain, may be better off on cannabis than on opioids, depending on what pain they're facing. I have quite a negative view of opioids myself. But anyway, I think you will find people in the Transhumanist Party who are sympathetic to your views. But anyway, I really appreciate all of the engagement. This has been a more extensive Q&A session than I even expected, 2 hours and over 41 minutes now. And thank you, Zach, for joining us as well. I appreciate both your questions and your commentary helping us answer a lot of the members, both on the stream and in the YouTube chat. I want to keep up this kind of engagement. I want to point out I am accessible to the memberships, and these weekly virtual enlightenment salons are another way to get a hold of me. Every Sunday, usually at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time, though with some possibility of variation from that. We are here and we hold these kinds of extensive conversations. Often we have great guests as well, or we can even have virtual concerts or presentations from various conferences that are aligned with our aspirations. So please, if you're new, keep coming back, because you will hear a lot of ideas on the future of humanity that I think you will find interesting, thought-provoking, and hopefully ideas that can change the culture in a more positive direction. So thank you all for joining us. Live long and prosper.